presentation here on mobile phones and health. So welcome, Dr. Carlo.
Thank you. I was the last person added to the program, so I don't have any slides. And what I would like to do is speak briefly in follow-up to the very important work that Dr. Oberfeld has presented. And then later on, maybe during the question and answer, we can get to some of the other general issues. You know, one of the things that we have now noticed in the United States is that we have in our registry, in our nonprofit Safe Wireless Initiative, we have the only post-market surveillance database in the world for people who believe that they have symptoms related to electromagnetic radiation exposure gathered. We set this post-market surveillance database up in 2002. The first 6 months of having the database in place, we had more than 1 million visitors. And since then, we have logged records for more than 30,000 people. The interesting thing is that in 2002, 2003, and 2004, and even into 2005, most of the complaints were from people who use mobile phones. And the complaints were very similar to the types of things that Dr. Oberfeld talked about. And the connection that they were making was to putting the phone up against their head. And in terms of the exposure to the radio waves from the phone, that's what we call the near field. Now, in the past year and a half to 2 years, 80 to 90% of the registrants are having the same types of symptoms, but they don't mention using mobile phones. They mention living near mass. They mention being in areas where there's Wi-Fi or WiMAX. And that information, coupled with the type of resistance that I think many patients get when they go to their doctor, coupled with the type of resistance you have in the scientific community, where you have a diversity of symptoms coming from one putative cause, and this runs contrary to what we normally see in public health, because you usually have an exposure like asbestos leading to mesothelioma of the lung, or you have an exposure like cigarette smoking leading to lung cancer, or an exposure like vinyl chloride leading to angiosarcoma of the liver. It's usually a one-on-one situation. So that the retort is always, we've never seen anything like this before. So the data that indicate such a diversity of symptoms have got to be wrong. And because we had this clinical database and a very good working relationship with clinicians who are dealing on a one-on-one basis with patients with these complaints, and the good thing about getting information about cause and effect from doctors, contrary to what most epidemiologists might say, is that when you have a doctor working one-on-one with a patient, he can try something, and if that doesn't work, he can try something else as an intervention. And if that doesn't work, he can try something else as an intervention. And sometimes the best evidence that something is there is the ability to take it away. So with that type of information, we have gone forward over the past year and a half to try to see if we could understand a mechanism that might be so common as to explain the diversity of symptoms that we see reported in our registry. And this is what we've learned. The first thing is that the carrier signal for wireless technology, and again, in this window, I should point out that Dr. Oberfeld talked about effects in 2 different windows in the electromagnetic spectrum. He talked about effects in the extremely low frequency window and the ELF window. separate mechanism from what we have in the radio frequency mechanism, or window. There are two distinct mechanisms that we now know are operating. And that's very important to understand that all electromagnetic fields are not created equal when it comes to health effects. What we've learned about the radio frequency window is this, is that the carrier signal, 1900 megahertz for example, is oscillating too fast for biological tissue to recognize. Think about this, 1900 million cycles per second. Your heart beats at 2 cycles per second. It's too fast for our biological tissues to recognize. So that unless you have a high amount of power pushing that raw signal, and a high amount of power generating heat, like you would have in a microwave oven, you do not have recognition by the biological tissue. However, because it's necessary for information to be carried over those signals, and Dr. Oberfeld has an unbelievable example that he's shown you, this 8.3 hertz constant signal that is hidden as the traffic modulator, which isn't even supposed to be there. But in the hertz range, your body can recognize it. And here's what we've learned, is that on the cell membrane, on the ectomembrane, the outside of the cell membrane, there are two types of receptors. You have chemical receptors, which are structural receptors that are lock and load. When you have a nutrient coming through, the receptor grabs onto it, and then it sends signals inside the cell saying, I've got a nutrient, or I've got something I know. There are also vibrational receptors that we now know, and those vibrational receptors are able to recognize information-carrying radio waves, similar to the 8.3 hertz that Dr. Oberfeld talked about. Now, when there's a lock, when there is a resonance lock between the vibrational protein and the information-carrying radio wave, and the resonance lock is sort of like the guitar player saying da-da-da-dum-dum, which is the incoming wave, and then the receptor going da-da-da-dum-dum, now you have a lock. They're resonant. They recognize. And once the recognition happens, which occurs within milliseconds, now you have the job of the cell membrane to interpret, is this good or is this bad? Now, historically, information-carrying radio waves, as Dr. Oberfeld showed, not occur naturally. We filled in the gaps with radio waves and information-carrying radio waves. So the interpretation is that this is a foreign invader. That interpretation happens within 3 to 5 seconds. All of this is backed up by studies, by the way. So the interpretation happens within 3 to 5 seconds, and the interpretation is that this is a foreign invader. Now, because you have a foreign invader, the cell gets a message that it has to hunker down and protect itself. So a series of biochemical reactions that are intended to be protective ensue. One of those biochemical reactions is a sliding of the protein and the lipid layers on the cell membrane, actually closing down active transport channels. So you have a lessening in the permeability of the cell membrane. Active transport channels begin to close down. And when that happens, you have nutrients that are in the interstitial fluid not able to get inside the cell.